which makes me think about this secrecy of this national defense strategy that is possibly going to lead up to the war with China. Because in the same way that we have the issue in the conflict of Ukraine and Russia, and there were all these things that led up to it, I'm thinking this national defense strategy is exactly what we need to look at to see what's going to happen before there's a missile or a nuclear war with China. Because it's clearly outlined here that this is a call for war. This is the beating drums of war that we are that the Biden administration really wants. Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Arco with co-host, teacher and socialist Andel Lipson, right-wing teacher Jessica, and community organizing socialist Kenny Cepeda. We are online at what'sleftpodcast.com. Again, what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find that new domain name and link to our blog in the episode notes. You can also find our personal social media handles as at Don Eduardo Barca and at ZepDK on Instagram, and Jess's Twitter handle as at JHomie89. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. Thank you. Right. All right. So we today's topic, we'll be discussing the National Defense Strategy of 2022, specifically this country, the USA's Department of Defense National Defense Strategy. It includes the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review and the 2022 Missile Defense Review. And this is a topic that you had suggested, Andy, we discuss. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's something that was released on the 27th of October.
Yeah.
And it was discussed then. And you had brought it up before. I remember that you said that was something you wanted us to discuss, and we kept postponing it because of so many other topics that we were discussing, such as the episodes that people can look back at that we've discussed since. And I think it's always still relevant, since this isn't stuff that's going away. There's still a war going on in Ukraine and Russia, and there's all kinds of threats with China. And so anyhow, so it's always relevant. I think it's still relevant, I meant to say. Maybe you can share with us why you decided to pick up this topic.
Well, first off, before, let's see, Eduardo, we started What's Left in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
I think I read the National Defense Strategy of 2018 a year after it came out, and it made a big impression on me, as in terms of helping me understand why the U.S. was doing some of the things they were doing, and particularly in its talk of changing from a war on terror to changing its military to dealing with small insurgencies, to the developing its military to take on Russia and China as emerging threats. And I was struck by that. At that time, I didn't pay as much attention to the stuff about big data analytics and technology and the role of those things. But it was wait, the war on terror is over? They knew this before. And so I was very curious when I was told that this was coming out. And I don't know if these things come out every 4 years. That might be the case. Does anybody know if these are every 4-year documents, or do they not know? Okay. But so when this one was proposed to come out, I was very interested in what they were going to say, in light of the fact that, for me, as we talked about in a previous episode, I have really been following what's been going on in Ukraine, and what is really a proxy war between U.S., NATO, and Russia. And then, of course, we talked about Russia and its alliance with China, and China and Russia combining to talk about how they want to be the new sort of leaders of the world, and they think they will be better stewards than the current ones, the United States. We talked about that document, that the the Sino-Russia document, and that was that we talked about the National Defense Strategy document then. That was 2018. So my reason for bringing forward, yes, is I'm just I wonder what the United States is going to say now in light of what's going on in Ukraine, and then Taiwan recently happened. But really the bigger reason is I've come to really value in what's left, particularly now that Jessica, you're here, just the opportunity to talk with people from kind of different lenses about what they see in these things. So sometimes I get to force my comrades here to read things that they might not otherwise read, and just hear what they were going to say about it, and see what it does to help me kind of see how to look at this. So that's my biggest reason for bringing it here to what's left, is I'm really curious what you all make of it. I do think it has meaning in terms of understanding the world today. I will say that these are not like documents that are like squirreled away somewhere hidden. These are not secret documents. These are public documents. And it is clear to me when you read their writing that they are writing in the way a government talks to the public, which means lies mixed with truths, So that, I have to say, this is not some sort of like, oh, insider game document, although most people don't necessarily read this kind of stuff. But they are aware that this is written to the US public, to the Russian government. It's written to the European governments. It's written to the Chinese governments as a public document, of the way they're going to deal with the globe. So that's my reason for kind of wanting to hear what people have to say. And I find there's something real. I think that I found a lot of interesting threads in this document that were different than the previous 2018. And I want to discuss that, and impressions I had as well.
Today, Japan's national defense strategy and defense buildup program was released. The national security strategy was released. They also have their strategic defense strategy being discussed in the media right now. So they're very much in partnership with the USA. So that's right now on the list. Like as I'm talking, like as I'm thinking about the national defense strategy of the USA, I think the initial reaction I have to this, as I said, with the context of today's release by the Japanese, their strategy, is there's so much emphasis on making sure that military gets so strengthened against two specific countries. It is the People's Republic of China and Russia. And it's obvious, we've discussed this already, but it's economic warfare that they talk about the deterrence program in a way that is like these soft blows to try to get to these countries to compete with them, and not in all straightforward war with these two countries, but in these soft blows, trying to undermine their democracies or their countries, and talking about how we have to protect democratic value. And so I see lots of hypocrisy. But more than Russia, I feel, it's just my perception, that it's the whole thing was a barrage, like, statement towards China is the number one enemy of the USA. Have to build their defense systems. They talked about their cyber defense system and their spatial defense system, and how even possible attacks against their GPS could be something they have to be aware of. They talked about too, like, about the pandemic and how that gave them a lens and to see like how important it is to also discuss biological warfare. And they said whether it be handmade or whether it be naturally a natural pandemic, a natural biological, just another pandemic, right? So it is like setting up in this, as Biden and I forget and the National Defense Department, they're setting up what they're calling this. They don't say pivotal. They say this decisive decade, the decisive decade for which all of these things are going to have to happen at an accelerated rate. And it's like the language of the fourth industrial revolution, so clearly outlined in this. And it doesn't give me any more doubt in my mind. Like sometimes I get a little bit defensive. I've said this before, and get a little bit um, weary or cautious to share about the fourth industrial revolution as if I'm some, like, you know, conspiracist about the moon and flat earth and all these things. But it gives me, like, I'm so glad I was able to read it because it outlines perfectly what the industrial revolution is about. It also reminds me of the other document we had read about regarding microchips and technology and science, because that one was more focused on the development of the country that needs to get forward, and also in competition to China, right? Because they cannot allow any more of this work being done over there. They have to make it here in the USA. But this is specifically to the military. So, uh, so I don't see this. I don't see this in any way to try to create peace or negotiations, or their stupid gaslighting ways of saying that we're trying to deter and find ways to work this. No, it is clearly an alt-rightly statement of war. And I was listening to KPFA, and I was listening to Medea Benjamin. She was discussing her new book, which is called War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. And she had predicted that Russia wouldn't go into the Ukraine, and she got it wrong. And she said, and on KPFA, like, I got it wrong. And I'm glad she stated it. She was honest about that. But she's talking about how her book outlines just everything that happened before 2014 and before February 2022 that led up to this. Whereas we see it in the media as if this just happened because of the invasion of Ukraine. And she doesn't speak to it from that frame. She talks about it from the perspective of, like, how we've led up to it. And there is all of these war tactics that happened against Russia, which makes me think about this secrecy of this national defense strategy that is possibly going to lead up to the war with China. Because in the same way that we have the issue in the conflict of Ukraine and Russia, and there were all these things that led up to it, I'm thinking this national defense strategy is exactly what we need to look at to see what's going to happen before there's a missile or a nuclear war with China. Because it's clearly outlined here that this is a call for war. This is the beating drums of war that we are that the Biden administration really wants in this strategic what do you call it, manual, or the PDF file that I read, or whatever this thing is, the defense strategy thing, the link. So it's it really, it like fills in the gaps for me to understand when we're entering 2023, as we're in December, for what might happen in the future. Like, this will be like, oh, that's right. I remember we'd read this document, and it just makes sense why things are happening, everything into place, right? Like, this will definitely be something that I think that as an episode, people will look back on and see what we got right, what we got wrong, what we wanted our audience and our public to be aware of. Normally, I tend to think that these kind of episodes, they'll get low views or low, because it's sometimes a little boring. Like I said from the very beginning, like, it's kind of boring, this language and everything. But it is an important document, and I hope to further discuss it. And maybe I'll share some specifics from what I've read. But that's my initial reaction and points of view.
I think you did a good job, Eduardo, of highlighting some of the key, just kind of general points. Like you, I think it was interesting just kind of tracking, like, the through lines where the language was very, like, nationalist. I mean, obviously it's nationalistic, but like, these are our rivals, right? Definitely agree. It's like China and Russia, but it's like China, really, right? Like that is always first. And very kind of like Cold War language with like they call basically the competition with People's Republic of China like a pacing challenge repeatedly. So tracking like that kind of stuff, but then also all of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, kind of like Agenda 2030 language and through lines as well, like you were saying, Eduardo, with this stuff about resilience and some of the climate change stuff, transboundary conflicts, like that kind of language, which is, I don't know, I guess in my mind, I kind of categorize it more in terms of the whatever one world government, one world order type of thing. So that was one kind of highlight that I was tracking. I mean, obviously, just so much hypocrisy throughout the whole thing, like to the point where like it is boring. Like, you know, having read not too long ago that 2018 document, like there were definitely some differences and some new terminology, but you know, same old hypocrisy for sure in terms of like, yeah, like we want peace and eventually let's all eliminate nuclear weapons and that's the goal. But then like, here's a scenario where like we'll use them, right? And that same hypocrisy with yeah, so many elements in terms of just the, you know, critiquing China, right? Like the sort of intro section critiques PCR's coercive actions to shape the region, authoritarian preferences, rapid modernization, expansion of military. It's like, okay, look in the mirror. And then like these always afterthought sort of nods toward like, you know, taking care of our people or democratic values when, you know, I mean, the whole thing, it's everything that they're talking about in terms of investments and energy and security. Like, you know, I always just read it through the lens of like, what do you mean? Like taking care of your people? Like you're homeless, you're poor, you're sick, you're functionally illiterate. Like, I mean, that's just always, you know, coming back to class warfare and taking care of your own people before you start placing the world. But those are kind of old themes. So I am, yeah, after we finish kind of going around, I'm curious to hear like why in particular. I feel like you probably have a lot of thoughts on China, Andy, and like the way that it's framed. And I definitely think we should take a look at some point. Eduardo kind of referenced this briefly, but the section on cyber, like the cyber domain and space, I thought it was really interesting that those were always grouped together. And some interesting, lots there, but maybe we can go into specifics a little bit later.
I think that you both kind of got to a lot of points. You know, like the fact that it's set in China, you know, it's not Russia. Even though Russia is galvanizing the attention of the world or, you know, the media, Russia is a side fight. You know, China is the big fight and they're getting ready for that. And they're talking about long time periods, right? A decade, for example, and pace setting by China, you know, and but you know, and also I also saw, you know, the language of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. There were two things that actually stood out to me. The first one is interoperability, and the second was systems of systems. So they're talking about synthesis. They're talking about integrating systems, you know, and you know, that's what the Fourth Industrial Revolution is about. You know, integrating systems that exist and creating new system and integrating those as well. And so, you know, that involves all the departments. And so, absolutely, this is a call for war. You know, this is a, you know, they also talk about the private sector a lot. You know, Lipson has mentioned before that, you know, an increase of synthesis of the state and private sector is the state gearing up for war. And I think that's what they're saying. And they're also saying, and there's a part, I don't remember which section, but where they talk about like basically training the new talent and also throwing them into the private sector as if it's not happening now, and as well as competing with the private sector for talent. So they're telling you, if you step back, I think you can almost see like that's fascism right there. That's what happens when fascism, as I guess the stereotype that we know happens. And so, yeah, I guess those are my first thoughts. That and the other thing the question that I have, is who are they writing to, right? Because the things that they're disclosing, right? The military operates on a need-to-know basis. They have chains of command. They are very secretive, and they're obviously releasing some information, but withholding others. So this is chess. This is not, they have. This is something they're disclosing, but they have a bunch of moves in their back pocket, And so this is just a piece, to kind of, I think, integrate other people into the game, and well, in reality, we're all pawns in this game. And, even though Austin Floyd signs this, right, this is not Austin Floyd writing this shit. This is the ruling class of the United States declaring, their intentions, in order to maintain and perpetuate its power in the world. And because there will be a challenge, I think they understand that, and they have to get ahead of the game. So that's what I see in this document. And I'm more also curious about the things that are not said as well.
Eduardo, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to say one more thing, if that's all right, Andy, before you go on your long rant. I was thinking here about this document, how it almost is convincing, because they stated in their national defense strategy in the very first, the first page, they say that they have a responsibility to respond to the U.S. American people, to protect, promote global security, and to speak to and they like to emphasize, I think they capitalized all, ALL, like all volunteer military. Like we don't, this is a democracy, no? Like they recruit, right? Everyone's a volunteer here. So they have but this is before we move on, before I know you're going to say your piece. I was reading this in light of, there's an article by Ceasefire magazine from the UK, and it's about, in Theory, Anarchism, War and State. And one of the things from the framework of anarchism is that any war by the state is not necessarily to promote, as this is saying, promote democracy, or to try to uphold as this country is saying, to uphold American way of life, or the values and principles of the American way of life, but rather to expand its empire. That's what this article that I'll share in Theory, Anarchism, War and State. And that's why in the very beginning, there were these two Goldman, and there were these two, where is it here? I had it highlighted here. Hold on. All right. That's why in the First World War, anarchists Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were central in anti-conscription activism in First World War America, and were jailed as prisoners of conscience because they were of conscience. They were critiquing. Their anti-militaristic critiques placed a strong emphasis on socialist criticisms of the capitalist basis of war. Elites use irrational prejudices to manipulate people. That's what this document is. Manipulate people into fighting on their behalf. That's what this is about. It isn't, as this document is presenting, to uphold these American values, to make sure that to respond and to explain why it's China the one who's trying to creep onto us. No, it's every war by the state, by a capitalist state, is going to want to expand. This country is looking at this other one is expanding. No, they have to expand it first before everyone else. That's what the competition is between these big. But like the biggest players. We'll say that the biggest players of the biggest global players. Okay, go ahead.
So first off, yeah, I do think you have all touched on some of the major themes for me. First one being, this is a war document. Second one being, who is this written to? And I do believe it's not public, really. It's a public document written to the bureaucracy. I believe it's written to the U.S. bureaucracy about where things are going. It's not supposed to be read by regular people. It's supposed to be digested by the press, and they spit it out in the way, and that's where. So it is not a call to war. When they call us to war, they're going to use way bigger lies than what's in this document. But I do believe it's preparing the U.S. bureaucracy for war, and a war footing. But some of the things that really struck me first was one of the things that you all noted, that this was about. It really singled out China as the primary opponent, and that term pacing challenge, which kept being used. A pacing challenge, a pace car is one you're trying to keep up with, actually. And it actually, in many ways, it was the first acknowledgement. If you think back to the first document, where they were just saying, hey, we've got these emerging powers on there. We've got China and Russia kind of coming up. We've got to start taking care of them. That's what we're setting ourselves up for. 4 years later, they're now, first of all, they've said, no, China is what we're dealing with. Russia is a smaller player. They put out China it's so clear China is their big opponent. Russia is down here. And then below Russia is Iran and North Korea. And then somewhere in there is violent extremists, somewhere down there below that, the ones that they were so worried about over the last 20 years that have now just gone to the bottom of the depth chart. But it was very remarkable to me, in the teeth of this conflict with Ukraine, that, in my opinion, is not going well for U.S. For all the talk of how difficult it is for Russia, I don't think it's going well for U.S. and it's not going well for maintaining the alliances that are so often talked about in this document, like building their alliances. And certainly, if you look at what's happening in terms of Saudi Arabia and other, and some of European powers in Africa, and even some in South America, it's very troubling. I think it paints a picture of their alliances fracturing, even in a document that speaks to, we will be building strong alliances, which they kept on saying over and over again. So it was remarkable to me that in the face of an actual real conflict with Russia that's going on right now, that this document was very clear-eyed in saying our primary opponent is China. And it caused me to see the war in Ukraine, which is a proxy war with Russia, to see that conflict as U.S. conflict with Russia as a proxy conflict with China, particularly in the context of the agreements that are being reached by Russia. So I do believe now that all these, I come to really feel like, and they don't talk about it in this way. They actually in the document speak of them as somewhat separate, as this sort of a field of players that they're dealing with one big player, the pace challenge of China, and a slightly smaller player, Russia, and then bit players of Iran and North Korea. They talk about it as different, but I think they look at them all as a piece, as basically everything's about dealing with China and making sure that the U.S. is not displaced. And I also think about it in the context of the book. I never got to talk about this book, The Long Game, which this book lays out China from the 80s to the 90s to 2010, emerging as an ally of the United States, moving to a slight, a silent competitor, but, look, we can work with the United States, to a full-blown emergence as a competitor with the United States. And that being part of the China strategy, as to reveal itself, unfold itself like a flower, to say, okay, now we are ready to take you on. And the first place they were going to be taking them on is in the Indo-Asian region. And it was so funny to look at the United States, which has a whole Monroe Doctrine and says we control South America, speak of, Indonesia and Vietnam and the Koreas as essentially the U.S. backyard, and China, how dare China go into these regions that are literally right next door to them, like 300 miles, sometimes 600, 800 miles away. The U.S. is thousands of miles away, and they are talking about the threat of China represents by its emergence in those regions as not just about Taiwan or Japan, but emerging as a competitor in any of those regions, and saying we have to put them in a box, and that's what And that's what this book is about China recognizing that the U.S. will do that. How do we hide within the U.S. wanting to use China to come out and emerge as the competitor we actually are? The other thing I noted was how long this document was compared to the other one. The previous document did not mention nuclear weapons. It did not mention ballistic missiles. It didn't talk about all those things. I think there's some very interesting things in the nuclear part. And for me, the boringness of this document, and it is more boring than the other document, in all honesty, because I've been listening to people like Colonel Douglas McGregor and Scott Ritter. Douglas McGregor is more of a U.S. military guy, and he was talking with the person who has actually his former CIA and trained some people in the U.S. military, and they think the U.S. military is very much not capable of challenging Russia right now, and really in a position of weakness in relationship to what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and they believe that the U.S. has to be completely reorganized, and they think it's completely fat, and it's like general and colonel heavy, and I actually read this document as a very conservative document of sort of maintaining the status quo. Like, it actually reads for me now as a document of an aging empire which doesn't know how to change its habits, because nothing in here takes a new course. It's all same old, same old. It has woke language in it. It has diversity. We're going to be a diverse army and things like that. It has these things that it's almost trying to sell itself to itself. But it's not actually striking out a new path. It doesn't even acknowledge that it's actually fallen behind where it was 4 years ago. And it doesn't in no way speak to what is it going to do? What is the United States going to do to make sure it comes out on top? Except to say it will not restrain itself from the use of its own nuclear weapons. It's not going to get rid of sole purpose use. It's not going to adhere to what's called sole purpose use of nuclear weapons, meaning, we'll only use it for this, nor will it refrain from first use of nuclear weapons. Not only will it not do that in relationship to a nuclear threat, they're saying they will not refrain from that in the possibility of non-nuclear threats, because they are speaking of China as having increasingly an array of threats, non-nuclear threats, that it can make to U.S. strategic interests. So they reserve the right to still say, we can do first strike on a country that isn't threatening us with nuclear weapons, but is threatening us enough that we feel like we got to use them. And that was remarkable for them to admit that in the document. But again, I think this is a document of weakness, and they're trying to threaten their allies or threaten their enemies into some kind of fear. It certainly is a war document, but I felt it came off weak and flabby and almost like, I think if it was a really good document, we wouldn't have been as bored, because it would have been talking about how all these it would have really been talking about how it's preparing itself to defeat its opponents. And really, I feel like it was a lot of trivialities, and there are a lot of banalities that aren't even true about alliance making and things like that. These alliances are cracking for them, and they had to blow up Germany's Nord Stream pipeline. Do they really? And they have made Europe dependent on their energy. Do they really think this is going to lead to a strengthening of the European alliance with them? They got to know that's not true. So these words are just literally words that they're saying to their own bureaucracy to convince themselves that we must go forward with this plan that will fail. And so on a deeper reading, this document was weak. Like it was a sign of weakness to me by how much lack of reality it expressed in itself. It showed in itself in terms of recognizing its actual situation they're in.
I think it's very interesting. I was listening to Scott Ritter, and he was talking about how Ukraine, how it's going really bad, in a way for the U.S. because just look at the amount of money they've dumped, in Ukraine, and they've actually dumped more money than the whole budget of the Russian military, into Ukraine, and it's still not over, and obviously there's another game, like Russia has to win decisively. This is Scott Ritter's point, that Russia cannot win by a little bit. They have to show that they won, because otherwise it's a failure for themselves. So I think if it's a stalemate, like the U.S. is losing because they're showing that the way they've been fighting, in the recent years, it's not working, and it makes me wonder, if they're thinking about the more direct clash, like this proxy wars, is going to be a thing of the past, and so they have to be ready for that moment, especially with a bigger power like China, when the time comes.
Just one brief question for anyone. What's up with the campaigning? I don't know. Is that just like, so they use it throughout the whole thing. Let's see, just as an example, the department will campaign day to day to gain and sustain military advantages, blah, blah, blah. Campaigning is not business as usual. It is the deliberate effort to synchronize the department's activities and investments to aggregate focus and resources to shift conditions in our favor. It's kind of weird because it's like election language, right? Obviously no one voted for this shit, but and then they define it in the intro section. Campaigning, the conduct and sequencing of logically linked military initiatives aimed at advancing well-defined strategy-aligned priorities over time. I don't know. Am I reading too much into that? But it stuck out to me because they kept going back to it.
I think I might be able to say something about that, but I'm going to start it with a quote that struck me. This was one they said about in the past, and they're talking about the U.S. Defense Department. In the past, the department's approach to deterrence has too often been hindered by competing priorities, lack of clarity regarding the specific competitor actions we seek to deter, and emphasis on deterring behaviors in instances where department authorities and tools are ill-suited, and stovepiping. Now, first off, you don't have to know what stovepiping means to actually know that this is speaking to essentially a system which has got interdepartmental rivalries. Things aren't going in the same direction, but stovepiping is an interesting term that they use, because what that is where a specific interest within a group tries to put forward a reality within the group to push their agenda. So what they're saying is that the various departments within the Department of Defense are actually competing with each other for money so they can get their projects and their push their sorts of things in that direction. And that's what stovepiping is. And so what this is, and the reason I think they're talking about campaigning is I feel like they know that they know they're in a situation where they're speaking to a bunch of departments that are in kind of a competitive war is a strong word, but they're competing with each other within the Department of Defense for money, for power, for influence, like a sclerotic empire. And so they're trying to get everyone on the same page. And so that's why they have to speak of all these things as things they're going to try to do. They're going to say, we're going to wage a campaign. We're going to all go in this direction. And so they actually have hearts and minds to convince within their own bureaucracy. So that's why I think it's being discussed in this way. That's why it comes off as so weak. It's like, it's all about things they're going to do that are kind of vague. But, and even what you read was very buzzwordy, it doesn't give you a sense of, okay, what are you actually doing? And that's why that's my answer to that. There is hidden underneath this, the revelation of how weak the U.S. military is, because this is something else Scott Ritter said. He goes, and Douglas McGregor said, we spend billions, way more than anyone. And he goes, we're not getting anything for our money. Russia's getting way more for the money it spends on its military. And he's saying we've only accelerated that by now giving them the actual experience of fighting a kinetic war with some of our forces. And now they're learning by experience. And we've only been fighting wars against small little insurgencies. We're going to get smashed by these people. That's what Douglas McGregor says. Because we're training them with our proxy fighters to how to kill U.S. soldiers who may end up dying anyway as more and more go on the ground there.
And I have a question that kind of relates to this notion that there is some work to be done in terms of getting everyone together, right? Like the joint forces, right? They also, that was another something that they kept repeating, I feel, like this idea of unity, right? Because there were news, right, like that the fucking Department of Defense, right, it couldn't find $2 trillion, right? And obviously there is a lot of corruption. You know, it's absolutely a lot of corruption. There's also clandestine operations. You know, but because you're saying this right now, it makes me wonder about that money. It's like everyone's doing their own shit, because even in other operations, like in Afghanistan, right? There were different agencies that were clashing in operations. You know, that they were running into each other in operations because they weren't communicating. And so here we go, right? We're spending so much money, $2 trillion in assets that weren't found from the, you know, this last audit of the, you know, the Department of Defense. And then just the last week, right, or something, they voted to increase again the military budget for the Biden requested, and they gave him like $50 billion more than he requested again. Like if they do every year, they give him a little extra spending money, and yet they're not having the decisive results that they think they should be getting. And so my question is, like, what do you guys make of that stuff?
Well, I think it continues to paint a picture of look, the U.S. military, the way McGregor talks about it is the U.S. military is an aerospace and a maritime military. We're not a military that can take ground in Europe, that can take ground in Asia. We can control air, and we can control the seas to some extent. That's our forte. But that's about it in terms of. And we've also lost most of the conflicts we've been in since the 60s. And you know, I just think that $2 trillion hole that it went into just speaks to an agency that there's a deep state in operation here that they can't get a handle on. Like they can't figure out how to get the thing to operate in a way that's going to push all in the same direction, so they can take on a competitor in a meaningful or in a productive way. And it's also interesting to me that the last time an audit came out was just before 9/11, and the Pentagon got hit, which had been the section of the Pentagon where the papers around that audit were done. So, like, I don't know what's coming now. But yeah, I think it for all the time when I think of the U.S. as a major military power, and it is, I think there's a lot more weakness in it than I think I might know.
What about dominance in the cyber and the space spheres? Should we pivot there? I don't know. I agree with what you're saying. I don't know.
Well, I'll say one thing. There was a video that I was thinking I would have you guys watch. It was a New World Order kind of conference. It was in October, where basically various Western elites were just beginning to talk about what's going on in Ukraine. It wasn't maybe in October, maybe it was July. And they were like, oh, well, Ukraine's going on, and what's going on in the world. And one of the things that one person said at that was like that the US and China have already been actually fighting in space and fighting in the deep sea. Like that there's evidence that there's actually been conflicts in those regions, that it's not talked about in the mainstream newspapers. And everyone seemed to nod their head and agree. I didn't know about this stuff. Like, I didn't know that there was actual kind of pseudo combats taking place, like destroyed shit up in the air and destroyed shit down in the sea between these two big powers. So that was something to hear. And they were saying, how do we keep this from unfolding into a war that destroys everything? That was kind of the thing when it's not just fighting going on in Ukraine with a proxy war with Russia, but there's already war taking place in space with US and China, and in the deep seas of our oceans, which I didn't look into it, but that people seem to accept it as a fact. The one thing I will say is I'll take this quote, which I thought was interesting, that I'll read. This was in their tech section. They said, we, United States, will fuel research and development for advanced capabilities, including in directed energy, hypersonics, integrated sensing, and cyber. We will seed opportunities in biotechnology, quantum science, advanced materials, and clean energy technology. We will be a fast follower where market forces are driving commercialization of military relevant capabilities in trusted artificial intelligence and autonomy. I like how they use the word, that trusted artificial intelligence, integrated network system of systems, that this is what Kenny was talking about, microelectronics, space, renewable energy generation and storage, and human machine interfaces, which is the stuff we were talking about with the Cyborg 2050, where they're going to basically try to get their soldiers connected to machines and have everyone reporting back to a machine, AI going back and telling you how to fight that war. So this is what this is their big play, and this is why what Eduardo was saying about this is not a what's it called, a conspiracy. They're going to be using this world as a playground for building their war machine.
Is the goal, I don't know, I'm just curious what people think with that. Like, is that actually their plan for reestablishing dominance, the US military, I mean, they're already well on their way. Like, the soldiers are required to wear wearables and blah, blah, but like, they're gonna turn, a transhumanist dream of like turning their human soldiers, all volunteer, into cyborgs, basically, or is this in some ways not so much about, I don't know, how do I want to put this, like, is it more about the large, like, this is one way that they can, they test everything on military, right? Like, whether it's vaccines, technology, right? And then that external, like, extreme situation, wartime, abroad, whatever stuff, of course, comes home to roost, right? And so is it just a way to like roll this larger agenda out? We've talked so much about transhumanism in education and so many other areas, or is it both, or I don't know. Yeah.
The way I see it is, I think of the Communist Manifesto, and like where Marx talks about like the need to expand into new markets, right? And I think in another episode we talked about how like physical markets are, everyone's like everywhere, so they're creating new frontiers, right? They're advancing to new frontiers, and this system is a system of competition in all domains, and ultimately, the power structures are underwritten by violence. That's what it comes down to, because I feel like the capitalists are to portray this system as like a somewhat honorable system of, competition, and like they kind of obscure the violence that goes behind it, the pure viciousness that that underwrites the whole system. And so I think it's all of it, and in the process of, and most technologies that we get come from the military, right? Siri, automated vehicles, the internet, drones, microchips, tracking technology, the Internet of Things, and when you brought up the question about space, that's one more domain. And that's why I find it very interesting. And I may want to suggest an episode on this. Elon Musk represents all that, and he has deep ties to these fuckers. SpaceX, right? SpaceX was providing internet to help the Ukrainians, quote unquote. But he was getting paid money, to do this by the U.S. government. Twitter is about censorship, right? He's not fucking doing it. Tesla is about data gathering. Tesla is not a fucking car company. It's data gathering company. Like I saw someone said that about like 90% of cars are getting data nowadays and selling your data. That's what the game is about. So it's all together, in this system of competition and violence.
So I think it's a loaded question in this group, Jessica, what you're asking, because I think Kenny and I are both going to see it as, no, this is really war making. Like, if you ask me, it's not a market. It's like now the market now the commercial market is really just literally a product now of war making, because war making is driving all of it. And Kenny's right. My understanding of capitalism is it's always been that way. But in times of emerging war, I think it reveals itself that its true nature, to show that all these things that are being tested out in the world are really about that competition, which must come in the form of war. So but that's just because we look at this as a competitive system and not as one that has this collaborative element to it. So yeah, I really believe, and I think that when they talk about these particular areas, this is where the pacing challenge of China emerges, because this is where China is putting the most. I think when they talk about the fact that they actually think that there's potential for non-nuclear threats to bring down or really create a giant strategic risks for the United States militarily, they're talking about these sorts of technologies. And so they are saying, we need to be able, and that's why they say our diversity, our democracy, we will do better than China because we have those. We're not authoritarian. I don't know what sort of smoke. I mean, it's words they say to themselves to make them feel better, but that they are trying to say to themselves, we will do a better job of being China than China, because a lot of what the U.S. is doing here is dealing with the pacing challenge of China, who is ahead of U.S. in most of these areas because it's ahead in data collection, and SpaceX is a particular thing. China's attempting to cobble together its own space program and has already apparently put one together enough to challenge the U.S. in space and have some kind of conflicts out there.
I just know, for example, like on GPS, China was ahead of the US for years. Like they had more satellites in space, to provide GPS coverage than the US had. I guess I do have a question. So where does, I didn't see, I didn't see Europe mentioned explicitly. It was just vaguely mentioned in the document. Is there any thoughts on that?
Just NATO ally.
Yeah, I thought I had seen it in the anchoring of our strategy and allies and partners and advancing regional goals. They discussed the Indo-Pacific region partnerships, and then Europe's partnership. They will continue their bedrock commitment to NATO collective security and acute forms of grace and coercion at sea. What I wanted to point out, I guess, is that they are in partnership going to enhance their intelligence and surveillance. What I didn't know is what this means. Reconnaissance. I don't know what that is. Well, and the electronic warfare platform. So, yeah, go ahead, Andy.
I mean, I think the biggest area they mention it is in NATO, and and using NATO as a pretext for challenging Russia or China. That's how I call it, pretext. But also mentioning the nuclear deterrence in those regions. Like that was where Europe figured pretty big in saying, number one, in terms of nuclear non-proliferation, the U.S. is not encouraging Europe to develop its own nuclear weapons. Like, it was kind of interesting to hear that, and was actually explicit in saying, we'll provide you the nuclear weapons to protect you, which really just means we want to have the say about when these things get used. And that was interesting to me, for all this talk of alliances, and even talked of shared defense, because that was the other thing. Like, they were talking about, like, we're going to build a stronger alliance. We'll be a stronger military like this. And again, I agree with McGregor. The NATO military is just U.S. it's just a U.S. shell. It's like the NATO is weak underneath all that. And so they know that. So what are they talking about when they say we're going to be stronger together? No, you're going to have to hold them up. And in fact, you kind of made it that way because you don't want them arming themselves, because you want to run the game.
I think the only part I wanted to bring up, but I'm looking for the part where I read it, was the climate change part, which we haven't brought up there.
It was up on page 14, I think, is the first Yeah, before we go there, I did just want to maybe read a little bit more on the cyber space. Sorry, like part of it printed out and then part of it online. So this is on 16 when they're talking about deterrence by resilience. Denying the benefits of aggression also requires resilience, the ability to withstand, fight through, and recover quickly from disruption. The department will improve its ability to operate in the face of multi-domain attacks on a growing surface of vital networks and critical infrastructure, both in the homeland and in collaboration with allies and partners at risk. Because the cyber and space domains empower the entire joint force, we will prioritize building resilience in these areas. Cyber resilience will be enhanced by, for example, modern encryption and a zero trust architecture. Kind of interesting in comparison to, I forget who brought up the trust thing earlier, but here, I mean, I assume they're talking about stuff like blockchain here, encryption. In the space domain, the department will reduce adversary incentives for early attack by fielding diverse, resilient, and redundant satellite constellations. So yeah, like exactly what Kenny was talking about with like Musk and his Starlink government contracts. We will bolster our ability to fight through disruption by improving defense capabilities and increasing options for reconstitution. We will assist allies and partners in doing the same. So just interesting language. And I mean, that's definitely a very like 4IR section, I feel, just in terms of how it's framed. I don't know, like how, like we kind of talked about like the weakness of especially like ground military, but how do you guys feel in terms of this idea of like the cyber space as a field of war and like the US as a competitor to China and others?
A field of war?
Well, I mean, that's how they're presenting it, right? It's like, here are these other spaces, like where, and just what Andy was talking about, like literal war. And I mean, and the whole like cyber pandemic thing that was being talked about a while back, and you know, and it being like the new frontier for terrorism, you know, like Russian cyber terrorists and stuff like this, and then space, obviously a whole different ballpark. It's weird how they like collapse them I mean, I sort of get why, but
I've actually heard like military people talking about that, you know, like in terms of the domains of war, you know, air, space, land, sea, you know, and the human domain, which actually I think takes another dimension once you talk about, you know, like programming people and stuff. And then the cyber domain, and now like all these things connect in some way, you know, and will connect. And like, so sabotage is a thing, you know, for example, that you can do with, you know, in for example, the US, I think, knows that it doesn't have the capacity, you know how many engineers China produces every year compared to the US? You know, like it's so many more, you know, like in that field. So that will be a challenge for the US to keep up, you know, just in terms of numbers. And you know, like and of course they're trying to fight that fight, but that's why I think this document, you know, the way we're trying to read it, I guess, or where we're kind of interpreting, you know, as of certain concern, you know, like what I hear basically is this document saying, look, we have to get serious together. You know, we all have to get serious, you know, because we are behind, you know, like in terms of like, they're not clashing directly with the major fights yet, you know, because I do think there is cyber war happening. Like, you know, you were saying about space, there's absolutely sabotage, you know, happening with each other, blackmail and all that shit. And so it is a domain that they're fighting and they're preparing for it, and they have people, you know, you know, when we're talking about like the human assets that they want to invest in, you know, this is one of them. They want to steal the tech people, you know, like, you know, a lot of the greatest mathematicians, have either gone to the military or tech companies, and so they want to make sure that more people are funneled into the military or through the private sector. That's what I hear, them like making this connection of that system and also having to compete with the private sector if they have to, for this, and again, but that speaks to the interest in being able to compete in that domain, the cyber world.
Yeah, and what I would say is if you are a global empire and attempting to be a global hegemon, and you feel like a competitor can threaten your ability to see clearly in any part of your empire, or to throw up illusions for you, to essentially give you false information through various means, cut out information and give you false information, and you see your opponent building its own network of infrastructure to get proper information, and then also to develop the artificial intelligence that is going to be used to process that information and make decisions about it. The AI is seen, data is the new oil, and AI is seen as the transformative technology for this century. And I do think that the U.S. is worried that they like in the same way that Big Blue, beat the champion in chess, or they maybe cheated a little bit, and then later they've had AI could beat a League of Legends team, that was training for a long time to play these video games. I think this is the kind of thing they're worried about, is a human opponent using an artificial intelligence asset of some sort to completely change the field of terrain they're working in, because it's an electronic one. So that's what I think is the worry, is that for all their aircraft carriers, for all the money they've plowed into to ICBMs and all that kind of stuff, I think they feel vulnerable in relationship to the tech that connects it, and they feel like an opponent could take advantage of that and put them in a very bad situation. And because of that, I think they're threatening China with the idea of, if you go too far with this, we're prepared to use nukes on you for first use. And kind of what they said.
I think that's also why they're racing, the US wants to set the pace again. They always have, and, quantum computer is important in this too, because it's about the speed of processing information, making decisions, and, all this stuff. And I actually have a question that relates to technology and this competition in the wars with China. They announced the fusion breakthrough, right? Like, is that something that should be considered in this scenario, or I'm not so sure about that.
I have my own questions about what the U.S. has been able to do there. And personally, I'd like to hear from our friend Eric Lerner what he thinks of what they've done, because there's a lot in there that just seems very poised to speak to energy independence. Here's what, and to sell it well before they've even developed anything. So I'm not going to buy yet that they've made any major breakthroughs there.
I have something else I'd like to bring up that is not sure if I want it in the episode. But if you'll look at here on page 6, and if you look down at this is what I had also felt was these sentences where it says climate change and other transboundary challenges. If you look, it says climate change is creating new corridors of strategic interaction, particularly in the Arctic region. It will increase demands, including on the joint force, for disaster response and defense support of civil authorities, and affect security relationships with some allies and partnerships. Insecurity and instability related to climate change may tax governance capacity in some countries while heightening tensions between others, risking new armed conflicts and increasing demands for stabilization activities. And then it brings up COVID-19. This is why I'm not sure, because I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but that about supporting like the defense support of civil authorities and disaster response, am I reading into it that it's because climate change is going to be used as the COVID pandemic was used to be able to control people, that the military will not only just be used for foreign, like intervention, but rather also domestic intervention used, as it says, in support of civil authorities to support like what's happening if someone was to go against what the narrative that's being given in the USA say, you have to do, or the restrictions being placed and the curfews, as we saw, and the limitations and the lockdowns and everything like that. But the military will then also be used to support these civil authorities to enforce whatever restrictions are placed on us and imposed on us. Is it, and then it talks about COVID-19 pandemic just after that. Is it too much for me to assume that that's what they mean, that they will then also be used if necessary domestically? Or am I just reading too much into it? And that's why I don't want to really include this, because it's just something I have as a question that I wanted to bring up earlier.
I don't think it's a stretch at all. I mean, that section reads literally like it's right out of fucking what's his name? Klaus Schwab's book, COVID-19. I mean, it's a little more tempered down, I guess, but I mean, his segue is really clear. Mm-hmm. I don't think you're wrong.
Yeah, and just understand, like, they know that if the conflict with China is coming, the last major world conflict, first world one, was they used the Espionage Act to say if you tried to stop the U.S. from entering World War I, you're going to jail. And then in World War II was the Smith Act, which was basically anybody who opposed the U.S. entry into World War II would go to jail. So they know that. I think it goes without saying that they will use under the context of fighting a war, they're going to use the U.S. military to put people who might oppose it in this country in jail and worse. But certainly they're going to exercise control. For me, what's most interesting, and they even have an own section on it, is how they understand the Arctic as a strategic region of fighting this future conflict. There's probably things I don't understand about that was just interesting to me, that they were basically laying out this place, and I think climate change isn't what it's about. There's something else going on that is making the Arctic an important part of this future war that they foresee.
In the past, I made a comment about like Russia. Fighting Russia is important for that because Russia has the most military bases in the Arctic than any other, power in the world, even the U.S. or Canada, or so they have dominance in that domain. If you put it that way, and like what I've heard is that as like the ice melts, there is going to be more trading routes through that area that are faster than going down, and also petroleum, or gas and oil. There is deposits in those areas. The U.S. right had deposits in Alaska, right, and so I think those are some of the reasons that domain is important to also engage in, and that's why I think that the U.S. or NATO, quote unquote, wants to bring in Finland, and those Nordic countries into the fold, because that region will be, up for grabs, in a more intense way. That's just what I make of it.
I agree, Kenny. That's what I had also heard that as well. And as I'm just searching quickly here on a quick search on the web browser, it is the Russian-controlled Northern Sea route is one of the only way ships can sail through the Arctic. Melting sea ice could open passages around it by 2035, which is going to be by then they're going to try to maintain control of it before it starts melting and creating these passageways that are going to be feasible for ships to pass. But yes, I had heard about that as well, and that's why I think the Arctic region is important, whereas it was very difficult to challenge. It was a challenge to get through. What?
No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just add, I don't know enough about military history, but from what I do know, I mean, Alaska is there's so much shady shit going on up there in terms of military bases and projects. Even going back to our chemtrails episodes. Yeah, so I agree.
And I think that maybe speaks the fact that the Alaska is part of the U.S. speaks to how far ahead these fuckers think.
True that.
All right. Well, I don't have anything else I want to share.
I think I'm mostly settled. I mean, I'm just glad we got a chance to talk about it. It's definitely giving me more things to think about.
Well, since anyone else?
Just looking forward to the new edition of the National Defense Strategy.
Maybe the next one will be 120 pages.
And he never gives us like light, fluffy homework.
And we'll see how much progress they make in finding, the trillions that are lost every year.
And I don't want to include this, but it's so interesting how COVID was such a little throwaway line in this thing. Like they couldn't be like, this document could not be bothered with COVID. Like they know this is not anything to do with anything. We'll just kind of throw it in there. I was like, by the way, there's been this whole thing that we've been telling you is the most important thing that we don't give a shit about. So we'll just put a little line in here just to like make sure we don't at least completely ignore this pandemic, which supposedly changed our whole lives and blah, blah, blah.
They did on alongside the budget, right? They took away the COVID mandate for the military.
I think so. Yeah, I saw something about that. Or I don't know if it's still being like, I don't know, when it goes through the fucking legal system, it's like, did it really get dropped? I don't know.
Right. Thank you all for working your way through as much of the document as you could. Appreciate you just sharing your thoughts about it.
Well, that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast challenging the mainstream left to post information about our topics and our guests in the episode. That's where we found this episode on our blog at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast /channels there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you have heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on notifications to any of our platforms on Spotify, iTunes Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, BitChute, Odyssey, YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram. And you can find our blog, any of those links in the episode notes where we found this episode. If you'd like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. You can also find our social media handles as at Don Eduardo Barca and at ZeptiKE on Instagram, and Jesse's Twitter handle as at JHomie89. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host Jessica, Kenny Cepeda, and Andy Lipson. We'll see you all next time. Ciao. If I ever have anything on my face, whether it be on my cheek, nose, or something, please say something. Because today, sorry, I'm distracting, but today I was talking to someone and I had eaten some nuts, some maple sugar nuts. And so I was eating it on the bus and I went to go pick up my nephew and it was the last day of school. And I was talking to parents and I had like the sugar coated like part of the nuts here and no one said anything. And then finally I was looking, I felt something and then I looked at the mirror. I have a little mirror for myself. And then I said, why didn't anyone say anything? Jesus. So anyhow, so please say something. I don't want it to be permanent online forever for me to have something.